Okay, so we are back with Carnage, and you guys are gonna have to bear with me. I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize if I'm not my normal excited self. But what this does is this basically focuses on Carnage becoming the Godbreaker in one of the coolest ways ever. So what this does is this initially opens up by talking about the nature of Nidavellir, right? Kind of the weapons forging place for virtually all the gods in existence. And what it shows us is that Nidavellir is effectively a tomb. Now, this is one part due to the War of the Realms and one part due to the God of Hammers storyline. Now, the War of Realms we've talked about, the war with Malekith and all that kind of stuff. The God of Hammers was relatively new. You guys will find a link to the Thor playlist down in the comment section so you can get caught up on that story if you're interested. But the idea behind God of Hammers is that it built on the origin that had already been established about Mjolnir itself, that in years past, it was believed that Mjolnir was just a hammer forged by the dwarves using Uru metal and then had the enchantment placed on it by Odin that only those who were worthy can lift it. What we had learned recently was that within the hammer itself was quite literally a cosmic entity that had been harnessed by Odin and was the source of the hammer's power. Hence the reason why it was able to do such incredible things, and why more recently, when Jane Foster became Thor in what I consider to be the greatest Thor run ever told, that the hammer was able to choose her and no one else could lift it if the hammer didn't want them to. So kind of giving it a personality of sorts. But during the God of Hammer storyline, Nidavellir, at least what was left of it, was basically eradicated, right? Like all the dwarves are by all standards of measurement dead, or were more or less dead. I mean, there are still some that are there, but it doesn't quite matter because once Carnage gets here, he kills everybody, right? Now remember, Carnage is on a quest for godhood, but we don't really know exactly what the end goal is. He's just kind of grabbing these little bits and pieces here and there. But all of it comes to a head in this story, and we find out exactly what it is he's been getting all these bits and pieces for. Now with Carnage showing up here and laying waste to virtually all the gods, or at least all the dwarves that are here in existence, what he ends up doing is approaching a cell. And when he gets there, the person within that cell immediately tells him, just so you know, before you ask your questions, the answer is going to be no, because I know why you're here. You're here for the same reason that anybody else has come here looking for me, and I'm always going to tell you no, just like I told them no, right? And literally Carnage says, I want you to forge me a weapon, right? To make a fearsome weapon, the likes of which all of existence has never seen before. So it's kind of cool, but in fact, Carnage is lying to a degree because the weapon he's talking about is going to be a weapon that we've seen before. And I think you guys are gonna freak when you find out what this weapon is, because it's gonna be one of the coolest things. But of course, the response of this guy is just definitively and resolutely, no, that's never going to happen. Now, the funny thing about this is that in the last story arc that we did, when Carnage had traveled to the realm of Hell and faced off against Hela, one of the things that she had said is that if they're able to travel here to Nidavellir and they're able to enlist this guy's help, he would do it for his freedom and his life. They basically agreed to set him free to go about his life doing his thing, and that would be enough of a barter. And so initially his response is still no. And in fact, he even says, my name is Drorin Runehauer. He's basically the brother of Eitri. Now, Eitri is like the king of the dwarves. And one of the things that I want to establish here is that one of the big, I guess maybe misconceptions of the dwarves in the Thor mythos is that they serve the Asgardians. Not really, right? The dwarves are just kind of like their own group of people who do their own thing, and they're well known for forging weapons, but they're not really beholden to the Asgardians. It just happens to be that because they're so good at forging weapons, the Asgardians are always hitting them up. But the Light Elves hit up the dwarves as well, along with like trolls. Trolls have done the same thing, right? Like anybody out there who's looking for incredible arms and armament will always go to the dwarves of Nidavellir because they're the best weapons forgers in existence. But what he says here is that in his mind, and the reason why he's even in prison in the first place, is because he spoke out against Eitri. That over the years, whenever any group came to the dwarves for manufacturing weapons, they would always use them for like nefarious purposes. They would always use them for war and different things like that. But the reality here is that building weapons is just one of the things that dwarves are capable of doing. They can also build incredible tools and instruments of building as opposed to destroying, but nobody ever seeks them for that. And so the response of Drorin was to say, we should just shut it all down. Like we should just end the forge and everything because this will never end. And in fact, given the level of fighting that took place during like the War of Realms and all that kind of stuff, which almost laid waste to the entirety of the realms as we know them, all we're doing here is supplying weapons that will ultimately at some point lead to our own destruction. So we should stop. And so the response of Carnage is, I totally get where you're coming from. That makes perfect sense. But what if I told you that the weapon that you're going to craft for me is a weapon that I would use to wipe out the gods, to end anybody out there that would try to hit you guys up for instruments of war, to remove and to destroy any of their opposition out there? This would be your final weapon, the final weapon created by the dwarves themselves. And so ultimately Drorin ends up signing on board with what Carnage wants to do. And so following this, we switch over to John Shade. Right now, John Shade, ever the detective, has basically just been on the hunt for Carnage ever since things popped off in the beginning. The funny thing about this is that being imbued with a portion of the Carnage symbiote itself, while it's not enough to overtake John, it has taken him on an adventure that he could just never really even begin to comprehend in his life before all of this had gone on. And so even in his conversations with the piece of the symbiote itself, he kind of comes to this realization there is no going back, that what he's experienced here by virtue of this adventure is a paradigm shift, that he has been irrevocably changed. So even if everything all calms back down, the story arc ends, he goes back to his life as a detective, he'll always kind of daydream about grander adventures because he's been there before. He's been down that road before, so it's kind of cool. But again, he's still stuck in the realm of Hela. And so what he ends up doing is traveling to basically one of the portals that's guarded by one of the frost giants that's effectively died and then been sent to hell. And so initially he's told, you cannot pass here. But the funny thing about the Carnage symbiote talking to him, or at least a little facsimile of it, is that it kind of calls him a coward, and it calls him to question whether or not he's willing to do whatever it is that he needs to do in order to come out on top. And that flies in the face of everything that John Shade knows. And so the thing that he comes to this realization here is, it doesn't matter, right? He wants to find Carnage, he has to do whatever it takes to find Carnage, which means killing this guy on the spot. Literally, he kills him just right there. And it's kind of nuts because following that, he ends up passing through the portal and seeking out the main Carnage symbiote. Now, because this little portion of the symbiote is tabbed, or at least is part of the main Carnage itself, that ultimately it knows where Carnage is, right? Like he's able to just kind of hit on it as a beacon. And so it ends up leading John Shade to Nidavellir. And so following this, we end up switching back over to Drorin and to Kenneth Neely. Now remember, Kenneth Neely is the guy who was obsessed with the idea of Carnage. He was basically trying to get his attention and really had like a false perception of what the symbiote was about. He learned pretty fast that this version of Carnage is drastically different than the one that he knew. And in fact, we'll talk about that over the course of this video. But what ends up happening is Drorin comes to this realization, or maybe he even knew it when Carnage initially hit him up in the first place, that this weapon Carnage intends to have created is not going to be used strictly for the elimination of any gods and anyone out there that Drorin simply just doesn't want to make weapons for, that Carnage is going to turn it against everybody, right? Which includes Kenneth and Drorin himself. And so if for no other reason than most likely self-preservation, Drorin comes up with this plan. And what he does is he tells Kenneth about the nature of the forge of Nidavellir. And what he tells him is that when it comes to just crafting any arbitrary weapon that's out there, they usually just pull in like a star. Quite literally, stars flying overhead. The forge pulls one of the stars in. But when it comes to crafting weapons of significance, something like Uru metal, the hammer of Thor, which is made from Uru metal, that they actually pull in something like 50 stars. But he says they have to be careful about it, because if they pull in too many suns, it would actually destroy the entirety of Nidavellir because it wouldn't be able to contain that much energy. But the fact remains that what he says is that there is no Uru metal on Nidavellir anymore. It's all been spent, it's all gone. So the idea of crafting this uber weapon for Carnage is a ruse. He literally lied to him. Like, yeah, we'll craft your weapon for you, but the entire intention of this is to open the forge to make it look like he's building something of significance, but in reality, what he intends to do is pull in something like 50 or 60 stars and just destroy the Carnage symbiote using the power of heat and pressure, which would actually work, right? Because remember, one of the big weaknesses of symbiotes is heat itself. Following that, he breaks out a kind of multi-dimensional Rubik's Cube that would basically allow them to travel anywhere they desire throughout the entirety of the multiverse. Now, one of the big limitations here, and this is one of the things that I want to specify, when I use the phrase multiverse in relation to the Thor mythos, we're really just talking about different realms and dimensions. And so what ends up happening here is that when Drorin asks Carnage, what weapon am I making for you, right? What is it that you want me to to craft. The response of Carnage is, "You will craft for me a weapon designed to kill gods." In years past, they call it All Black, the necrosword, the Butcher's Blade. Literally, he's recrafting the weapon of Null, the symbiote god, which is dope. Like, it's ridiculously cool, right? This is one of the coolest things ever. So it's really exciting to see this, because in reality, while Null, the symbiote god, was able to use the sword to like kill celestials and so on, this weapon in the hands of Carnage would lead to the ruin of all. Like, it would lead to the destruction of anybody and everybody. And so following this, as the weapon is in the process of being forged, or at least the initial process is taking place, Carnage, of course, growing impatient, demands to know how long it's going to take. And that's when Drorin and Kenneth make their move, and they say it's almost complete. The construction process begins now. They ultimately open the forge, they pull in 50 sons, and they all descend on Carnage, and they kill him. They destroy the Carnage symbiote on the spot. Like, it literally eradicates the entirety of the symbiote, because it's like having Carnage thrown into just like a super sun composed of 50 suns. The heat and the pressure is enough to completely and totally wipe this guy out of existence. And so what's kind of crazy is that Drorin makes this commentary, right? He says, "Do you really think, having denied the gods themselves, I would lower this forge to some base pursuit of violence? Oh, you can squirm and lash and whip all you want, but there is nothing in all existence except Uru metal that can absorb the amount of energy coursing through you right now. And there has not been any in this forge, not since the dwarves who worked it perished. This is it. This is how you die. If even a mote of you continue to exist after a few moments, it would be a miracle. But this is basically completely and totally thrown into disarray when John Shade shows up. And this is the reason why. Remember, Carnage gave John Shade a portion of his own symbiote. And so when John Shade shows up here, the Carnage symbiote that's basically being eradicated reaches out to John Shade. And whether or not John does it of his own accord or because he's forced to do it by the symbiote, we're not given a definitive answer to. But once the two of them make contact, while the main symbiote itself seems to be destroyed, it's basically able to regrow itself using the portion that it got from John Shade. And the entire plan is null. It's all gone, right? It's literally over. Carnage lives on, and the first thing he does is kill Drorin, just like that. But then he, in turn, thinks about what it was that Drorin told him, right? There is no Uru metal on this place, not since the dwarves who had forged it had all been destroyed. And so what Carnage does is he seeks out the body of every dwarf on Nidavellir, realizing that in forging Uru metal, they would have had bits and pieces of it on them. And by sorting through the entirety of their bodies and absorbing those little fragments of Uru metal into them, under their fingernails, on their skin, in their hair, the whole 9 yards, he's able to piece together enough Uru metal to get what he wants. But doing this and using the Uru metal, in turn, Carnage bonds it to himself. Now, that's a big difference here. It's because initially what it looked like is all Carnage wanted to do was have an Uru metal blade that would have been equivalent, at least in durability, to Thor's hammer with the power that was wielded under Null, meaning that Carnage, as he stands now, assuming that we can argue he is in effect a walking, talking, all-black necrosword, is now comparable in power to a celestial. He's able to wipe a celestial out of existence. It doesn't mean he can necessarily create life on like a universal scale or anything like that, but in terms of durability and destructive force, this guy's god level now, right? There's a reason why he's called the Godbreaker Carnage, right? It's just this ridiculously amazing revelation for his character. Now, the other part of this is that because John Shade was the one that seemingly defied all odds and showed up here in order to confront Carnage, the Carnage in turn basically betrays Kenneth, that he'd kind of been leading Kenneth on this entire time and said, I will eventually make you my host, assuming that you're able to withstand, you have the stomach for all the things that we're going to be doing here. So that's kind of why Kenneth was following him around like a little puppy this whole time. He wanted to become the new host for Carnage. But ultimately, because of John Shade just proving his mettle, Carnage decides John will be the new host. And in this moment with Kenneth realizing he's about to die, he snatches up the cube and then basically punches in a series of coordinates and takes off, basically traveling to the one person that he knows is able to destroy Carnage. He arrives at St. Agnes Orphanage, where Cletus Cassidy resides. Now remember, Cletus Cassidy and Carnage had been separated for quite some time, but Cletus Cassidy was able to harness the power of one of these symbiote dragons that belonged to Null. He effectively merged with it, so he doesn't really have a physical form. Instead, by taking control of the symbiote and traveling back to the orphanage, he is able to basically alter and control all of reality within this house. Like, he controls it all. There, he is effectively God. And so within reason, given the fact that he also possesses the extrembio, right? Like the extreme symbiote, as it was called by Marvel, this guy really is the only one who can challenge Carnage, which really begs the question, what happens when we get to a point where Cletus Cassidy has to fight the Carnage symbiote? And with the two heightened levels of power that these guys have, what would happen if they merged? Because you basically have two guys who are in different degrees comparable to the power of Null, the symbiote god, who almost killed the Marvel Universe. Two people with that level of power merging into one, it would seemingly amplify their power 2, 3, maybe even 4 times over again. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.